Hey guys, Seth Fuller, your favorite attorney here. I was watching or listening to the Joe Rogan Experience podcast recently, which I do all the time, though to be clear, Joe is no Chael Sonnen. In any event, he had on conservative firebrand Matt Walsh talking about his new movie, What is a Woman? And the first half, they were so in simpatico. They were doing yes and bouncing it off each other, just discussing the many obvious issues of the trans movement and gender issues in modern woke society and the ridiculousness that devolves into. And of course, a lot of this is definitional, as you can tell from the title of the movie, What is a Woman? And because Matt Walsh was being reasonable in this, believe it or not, because he has a reasonable stance. Him and Joe Rogan you couldn't get along any better. So he's talking about his movie for nearly over an hour. I think it was definitely the most of the first half of the podcast. And then there was a switch. And the second half was literally Joe Rogan just owning Matt Walsh. Matt Walsh couldn't answer his questions in a reasonable, succinct way. He talked about that this was one of his issues. Twice he says his issue was the attack on marriage. Finally, the second time, Joe bites. And I expected Matt Walsh to kind of own Joe because he's obviously been thinking about this a lot. And I'm not sure that Joe Rogan does. And so, to my surprise, it was just a complete Joe was just coming up with point after point that Matt Walsh had no good, reasonable answer for. Now, he had an answer for that I'm sure a lot of people agreed with. But as someone who, I don't have a dog in this fight at all, I just thought it was compared to the previous half of the conversation, it was just so funny to watch Joe Rogan stump. I mean, Matt Walsh is famous for just asking questions and then watching while people stutter through non-answers or not satisfactory answers or unreasonable, illogical answers. And that is literally what you see. Go watch it if you don't believe me. The second half of the Joe Rogan Experience. So how did this happen? How can two seemingly similar topics on the political scale just go so differently for the same guy who's been thinking about both topics a lot and who pontificates and writes and expounds on these topics constantly? How did that happen? That's why I was interested in this. Not only that, it contains a lot of the things that I enjoy. Linguistics is something that I've been interested in, have an undergraduate degree in, and have been studying since for a long time. The law, which obviously that's what I do, and human rights and just basic reason. And so all these things make it real interesting for me. Politically, though, to be clear, I don't care about politics. I don't care what conservatives think, what Democrats think. I don't care of any of that. What I like to think about is how all of these, the main things, the ideological things. I'm kind of a justice nerd, so I like to look at it from a reasonable point of view and obviously a secular point of view, which immediately many people aren't. And I'll talk about that later. In any event, let's get on to what I saw. Why these Matt Walsh went from, easy trail, yes, oh, that's so great, haha, to, well, you see, and that's from the definitions. See, Matt Walsh, again, as you could tell from What is a Woman, the title of his movie, and pretty much the only question he asked throughout the entire movie, or variations thereof, he has a thing about definitions. And so he applies that same logic to marriage. And so you think, well, there you go. Then you have the same outcome, correct? No, and I think this is important because I think this addresses a lot of political issues. So essentially, Matt Walsh's argument against the woke culture of gender is fluid, gender is not, is different from biology and all that, is for him to attack definitions and the logic of using such definitions. And so he says, if you can't define a woman as a biological woman like we do, then it becomes meaningless and you don't know what you're talking about, which is right. That's what happens with definitions. If you are talking about something and the definition becomes so vague or encompasses so many things that the definition doesn't really accomplish anything, then yes, it becomes meaningless. But we got to delve deeper than that to see why he gets such great results when it comes to gender and not so much when it comes to marriage. And that is because there's two different types of definitions or classifications. The first type is what I call descriptive definitions, what you might call classification definitions, what you might call logical definitions, but I don't like to use that because that's confusing. But if we call it descriptive definitions, okay, these are things that we are looking at something and we are describing it. And in describing it, we're giving it a definition based on its characteristics. For instance, man or woman. It's not like man or woman is something we just chose and we're like, we want two sexes or anything like that. That's ridiculous. And that's part of the reason that the woke left gender policy or ideas fall apart immediately. There are penises, there are vaginas, there are uteruses, there are testes. All of these things exist and we can observe them and say, this thing has this and this thing has that. And therefore, if it has this, we're doing this. So that is literally a factual descriptive definition. Okay. So one thing I like to use, tumor. Okay. There's tumors. There's lots of tumors, but there's benign tumors. There's malignant tumors. And maybe there's some on the spectrum, but generally they divide it into those things. And two of those things, whether you have one or the other, completely affects your life. And it doesn't matter how you feel about one or another. It doesn't matter how the doctor feels about either one. I think we all agree we'd rather all tumors be benign, but that description is just a description, as opposed to the laws that we make. Pretty much all the laws are what I would call utilitarian definitions. And don't get me wrong, descriptive definitions have a lot of utility. They are utilitarian in nature also. But what I mean by utilitarian definition is we're not describing something specific. We're taking our notions of subjective normative, what should happen. We're observing certain things and saying we want the outcome to be A, B, or C. We don't call someone a man or woman because we want the outcome to be A or C. We don't call this thing a man because we want the outcome to be he has testes and produces sperm. No, that's just, we observe it and we say we're going to call this a man and this a woman. Again, descriptive. But all laws, murder. What is murder? Well, murder depends on which state you're in. What's the difference between murder and homicide? Well, again, depends on which state you're in. An important one that you can think about here in Texas especially is attempted murder versus aggravated assault deadly weapon. So if I shoot you with a gun, which one is it? Well, it probably fits under the qualifications of both, but there is a different intent for one. And the reason we make any of these laws say murder, there is a murder. The reason we define murder is so that we can then put people in jail who are doing this thing that we don't want. So it's not really descriptive. We're not looking at something and going, oh, this one is murder. We're saying we are going to define murder as this because we want the outcome to be this. So that would be what I would call a utilitarian definition. It's something us humans make up, not because we observe something and that we need to separate these two things for utility, but because we need to get an outcome, and by using X definition, we can get the outcome we want, or we should get the outcome we want. If we don't, we adjust the definition. And that's where Matt Walsh I don't know if he doesn't understand or if he just doesn't want to apply it. So for where he goes right is in his gender stuff. A man is a man, a woman is a woman. We didn't have there was really honestly no logical normative thing for, oh, this guy has a balls and testes, we need him to be a man. No, it was just a descriptive thing, and a woman has this, and we have generally two categories. We have intersex people too, but just the existence of those two does not mean the other two classifications are erroneous. In fact, we can literally say, well, this group is this type of intersex, this group is this type of intersect, and as we get more information, we can divide them up more, but in the end, we can still have the main two things of female and male and their descriptive definitions, as opposed to marriage. Marriage is pretty much a creation of humans. It's not something we observed and said, oh, this is that. It's something that we said we want to do something. And here's where Matt Walsh has it right. As with all good fallacies, it starts with correct thinking. Marriage is main utility, has been over time, certainly, to promote the best possible environment for procreating and multiplying. So in other words, since even before religion, there has existed marriage that pretty much just the reason we form these contracts, which is what every marriage is so that we have a great environment to raise our children in, because we need more children to replace us as we die. And the more children we have, generally, the better off society is up to a certain point. But he's right. Matt Walsh is right. We want to promote that. That is something we want to promote. And it is almost certainly the reason marriage was created. And it's almost certainly been the primary drive between all marriages in history until about 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago. But that's where he gets off the rails, because then he equates the utilitarian definition of marriage, which has changed over time. And he says that change is bad because then the definition becomes meaningless. And then he essentially applies the same logic you apply to a descriptive definition, and it doesn't work because it doesn't necessarily become meaningless, because the meaning was based on what your values were. And either if you don't agree on values, or your values change, or the final outcome changes, then you can easily change the definition. Okay? So in other words, you can have murder be illegal, and you can say that murder is A, B, or C. But when you find out that people who did something that everybody could do, it's not necessarily evil, didn't do anything wrong, didn't have intent to hurt someone, whatever it is, that doesn't fit murder. Well, then you change the definition of murder, or you add a defense. Self-defense is a defense to murder. But you can both change the definition of murder itself in order to allow for self-defense. Murder is an intentional killing of someone with malice aforethought, as many states do. Or you can adjust the definition and just have murder as any time you kill another person, have it synonymous with homicide, and then give defenses. However, if it was self-defense, you are not criminally responsible for said murder. And all this is details that I'm sure bore a lot of people, and if so, you don't want to listen to the rest of this, but it doesn't Matt Walsh. It applies directly to how Matt Walsh does this rhetorical trick of marriage that works so well in regards to gender, and goes terribly wrong under any scrutiny when it comes to gay marriage. So what he says is, by definition, marriage is between a man and a woman because a man and a woman are the only things that can procreate and have children. And this is how it's always been. And the minute we start tinkering with that definition, then we make it meaningless. And that sounds good because it's the same thing with gender, right? If you change anybody can be a man at any point, then it's meaningless, and doctors can't do what they do, and statisticians can't do what they do, and we don't know who's having babies or who's not, and it does make it meaningless, because what you're doing is you're taking a descriptive classification definition, and you're changing it so that it doesn't match the description. But marriage is not a descriptive one. He knows that. In fact, he says that essentially. Basically, what he tries to say is what we're describing is this procreative man and woman thing, but that's not what it was. It was similar. That's pretty much what we did. We wanted to promote it. Those are two different things, wanting to promote this thing and that we are just observing this thing and naming it. Because without marriage, some people are completely polyamorous, polygamous, have children with multiple people. This is in the history of human beings. Have children outside of any contract. Have children with multiple people across their lives. Have people live with them. Never see their kids. Let the village raise them. Don't know who their kids are. This is all if we were to describe what happens with human beings in copulation and procreation, this is what we would end up with. We would end up with what we see human beings do. But instead, we created a definition. Unlike gender, we didn't create that definition. We described what certain things are. We created whole cloth this definition of marriage. And Matt Walsh is right. This is a very old thing. And so what he says is, obviously, this was a description because in every society before this, we had this basics. Number one, we didn't have these basics. But let's pretend we did. Even before Christianity. In Mesopotamia, some of these earliest places where we can have, where we see marriage contracts, the first marriage contract. So we have to go back to 2350 BC in ancient Mesopotamia. And this is the first time one man and one woman entered into a contract. And that contract was essentially the man creates a stable household and the woman bears him children. And they would... basically, the man would give up his daughter and give his daughter to the groom. The daughter would bear the groom children, and the groom would provide a stable household and, by the way, some money. Because, again, in most societies until a couple hundred years ago, the women were essentially property. That's how they were treated under the law. Laws like marriage that we just made up. Now, women were property before that. Maybe that is descriptive that they were treated that way. But certainly when we made up these marriages, it was with regards to women being property. And that will be important further on in the reasoning. So these first ones were exactly as Matt Walsh described. One man, one woman to create a child. Now, throughout the years, there's been many societies, and maybe even before this, we don't just have records. There's been many societies who embraced this monogamous idea of marriage. By the way, there's been many who don't. And he says in every society it had to be between man and woman, whether it was one man or one woman, but he ignores many societies that were polygamous, especially because women were property. He could have as many wives as he could afford. That was very widespread. So Matt Walsh likes to completely ignore this fact because it doesn't go against his narrative of we're doing a descriptive thing when we do marriage. But let's say, and then he likes to do the slippery slope of like, oh yeah, well then we can have men marrying dogs. No, that has never happened. It's always been a contract between people because we don't allow anything but people and people of major age to enter into these contracts. And by the way, again, that's why the contract is with the parents of the bride and not the bride herself in a lot of these ancient parts. So essentially this was a contract for procreation. There's no doubt. And that's what Matt Walsh wants to be. And before you call me some liberal, no, by the way, I think this is what we want. Matt Walsh is completely right. We want to set up society so that children are raised in the most loving, stable household there is with the least amount of trauma, the least amount of fighting, the least amount of any kind of negativity so that they can thrive. Everyone agrees with that. However, how do we get that? Well, we can do these marriage contracts like in the early age, but these marriage contracts were a product of their society. There was no one marriage contract, which completely disputes Matt Walsh's implicit assumption that marriage always was this like procreational thing. Between men and woman only and monolithic thing, not procreative, monolithic thing. This completely undermines Matt Walsh's implicit assertion that the marriage was monolithic, and we can look at it. He just takes this one thing, man and women. It was never between man and man. It was never between woman and woman. He's right, because it was about procreation. In fact, it was so much about procreation that if the woman could not produce children, the man could submit her for a refund to her father and would submit her for a refund to his father. Now, I assume that's not what Matt Walsh wants. In fact, he says one of the things that Joe Rogan asks over and over and over again is, well, what about couples who never plan on procreating? And Matt Walsh is like, well, they don't have to plan, they just never will. But again, that undermines his assertion that marriage is about procreation, because the marriages he's talking about were about procreation. And so in the marriages that he's talking about, if you decided not to procreate, then there wouldn't be a marriage. There would be no marriage. You would return that woman who doesn't want to procreate. Or you would make her procreate, and a man who didn't want to procreate would never pay a dowry for a woman. So right there, Matt Walsh, that's the first time he started stuttering when Joe Rogan asked him, and this is why he can't answer that question, because you can't honestly talk about procreation without saying that the fundamentals of marriage, which he's right about, have been dissolved by the rights of individuals to not procreate. But what happens the minute you acknowledge this? That marriage was not monogamous everywhere, that marriage was about property, women as property, and that the women, that it was always about procreation. Well, Matt says, well, you have to keep it that way in order for marriage to have meaning. Joe Rogan asks him time and time again, why? Why don't those people have meaning? And the answer is the meaning has changed, but the meaning didn't change because we let gay marriage in. The meaning changed because our society completely changed and gave women the right to say no, gave women the right to not procreate, gave women the right to not marry some dude they don't love. And when we gave women the right to not marry some dude they love, we took away society's ability to only make marriage about procreation. At that point, marriage definition did change to when two people love each other, they form a contract that then the state enforces certain things about the contract that Joe listed over and over again, being able to have access to healthcare and private information, automatic death benefits, just many being recognized everywhere as one being able to contract as one person. All of these state benefits are the only thing left from marriage when you take out the man's complete ability to dominate any woman he can pay for. That's true. And again, this is not woke speak. I promise you, this is not woke speak. I'm just saying that the minute you give people these rights, you have to acknowledge that the original contract that Matt Walsh says gives meaning to marriage is the meaning of marriage and needs to be the meaning of marriage in order to be definitionally correct. Completely change all of those contracts and the fundamental nature of those contracts. Now the fundamental nature, and now Matt Walsh holds that, well, there you go. And now when you change the fundamental nature of the contract of marriage, and therefore the fundamental definition of marriage, which is true when we do that by giving women freedom, then you make marriage meaningless, and that is evidenced by it going downhill, except for one thing that, again, Joe Rogan wasn't equipped to. He did stump him several times, but one thing I would have liked to see him address, Matt Walsh, is the fact that marriage started going downhill when divorce became non-fault, or basically when we gave women the social okay and the legal okay to pursue divorce in and of itself, which they do at a much higher rate than men do. That happened in the 80s. The first gay marriage was 2004. So it took about 30 years between divorce the divorce becoming culturally accepted, to the first gay marriage. And between the mid 80s and 2004, there was a steady decline of marriage. Now, in order for Matt Walsh to logically say that if you take away the definition of man and woman being marriage, then that will make marriage meaningless. And that is shown that we are making marriage meaningless by doing that, by the steep decline in the amount of marriages in U.S. society. You have to then address why the decline began 30 years before gay marriage. In fact, the decline lasted longer before gay marriage than it has since gay marriage. The decline was 30 years old when we legalized gay marriage. And I mean the decline in marriage numbers. Down to the decline from now has now been less than 20 years old. Completely decimating Matt Walsh's particular argument there. So his argument about history is completely decimated by facts, logic, and reasoning. We did not historically always do marriage the way we did this. Marriage has always been something that we created and didn't just observe something and codify it. And just like any other laws, by the way. And while he's right that it has always been between men and women, the changing of the definition to same sex is absolutely logically not the reason for the decline in the popularity of marriage. Now, that still leaves some of Matt Walsh's issues that are absolutely true. Marriages are declining. That is resulting in negative things for our society, as general people consider negative things. More trauma for kids, worse outcomes, more confinement in prisons, less stable relationships, less communities, all of that. However, the one thing that he kind of brushed up on is the fact that it was divorce that caused that. So maybe Joe's right that we shouldn't. However, there's nothing in the definition that we couldn't apply to same-sex marriages, regular marriages, and even polygamous marriages about divorce that wouldn't curb this decline of marriage if you want to curb the decline of marriage. And the reason Matt Walsh wants to curb decline of marriage because he says that's very bad for society. Fair enough. I agree with that, but maybe some people would not, and you'd have to look at the statistics of crime over time and all that. But I think overall, we generally agree that that is bad, and the statistics seem to back that up. But more importantly, he doesn't address how we're supposed to not change this definition of marriage to where divorces won't happen without giving women the freedom to leave someone that they want to leave for whatever reason. And how we get culture to appreciate that and to put a shame or whatever we need to do to stop women from leaving it at a rate of somewhere around 40-something%, and cure what he says to be cured. I think we can all agree that we would like it to go back to generally stable marriages, with nuclear families that raise kids in a loving way with lots of support of both male and female people who share the labor, divide up the labor and share the raising of the kids, and each have their own personality that they contribute to the kids, but also not have women or men, either one, trapped in loveless, abusive, or other type marriages. How do we accomplish those things? And Matt's only answer is for us to keep the definition how it used to be and not let gay people marry, which again, completely unreasonable. So why is he so unreasonable in this, but so reasonable in the gender thing? I've already kind of explained that, and Joe Rogan detected this And what's funny is Matt Walsh says, kind of keeps pushing back against Joe Rogan answering this question, and then Matt Walsh later talks about it. Listen to this clip.
One criticism that I've heard from people on the right for how I approach this, and what I've heard from some Christians, is that I should have based my argument on Scripture, on God. I shouldn't have, as I'm accused, taken God out of it, which I didn't, of course. Anytime you're talking about the true definition of marriage, you can't take God out of that. God is there. But I should have explicitly said that marriage is a man and a woman, because that's how God designed it, and that's what Scripture declares. That's what they wanted me to say, and I didn't say that. But here's the problem. To me, it's quite obvious. To a secular audience, arguing that marriage is a certain way because the Bible says so is not going to be convincing or useful to them. It's not going to be a useful argument in that environment. Because in order for the Bible says so.
And there it is. That's it. The reason that Matt Walsh had a good, agreeable conversation the first half and didn't the second half, Joe Rogan called him out about his religion. He kept pushing back, saying, "You're the one who brought up religion. You brought up religion." Now, true enough, but the reason is because Joe Rogan could sense it. When you base your reasoning on a conclusion, you'll only be right the percentage of the time that coincidentally the reasonable conclusion matches up with the conclusion you already had. If that's confusing, let me rephrase that. If you start with X is a fact, such as gender is a fact, or marriage is a fact, or this definition of marriage is a fact, the only way you end up being right is if your reasoning happens to line up and answer that conclusion. But if instead, like Joe did with marriage, you start with the reasoning. What is this for? What obstacles are we facing? What are the issues? What are we trying to accomplish? And what limitations do we have to accomplish that? Then you reason through that. You reach a conclusion like gay marriage is no threat to marriage itself and has nothing to do with the breakdown of the nuclear family. However, if you start with the definition of marriage is what I think it is because of something outside of reason, aka faith, and here's where I get so frustrated, is if you're a person of faith, I'm 100% behind you. I'll stand by your right, as long as it's not hurting anybody else, to profess your faith and to live by your faith and to even go out and promote your faith. I'll stand by that right because I knew great men and women of faith. So I will never say that that is not the way. However, at least be honest and say that, well, I don't have a reasonable answer for this. I don't have some reasonable, logical reason to think that that marriage should be between a man and a woman and it should never end. The reason I think that is because I believe my God told me that that's the definition of marriage and that's what marriage should be. And therefore, I want marriage to be that. And that's great. And you should follow that. And nobody else is affected by that. But the minute you do go to promote your faith and you then try to back engineer reason to your conclusion, then some half-assed radio host, UFC commentator, and Fear Factor host is going to school you on it as long as he starts from reason. Now, once in a while, it will just so happen that your conclusion also matches up with reason. Right? Your conclusion that men and women are women that you've actually made based on religious belief could, by chance, be correct. But you're just leaving that up to chance, and you can't do that with every single thing, or you look ridiculous. But the one thing I'll say is, to me, it's just dishonest to go on a radio show, keep saying over and over that it's not about faith, that you think that you can do it, and then go on your other show and say, look, I needed to convince these people of my religious belief and that my religious belief was the right belief. So I had to use logic to do so. I had to use secular arguments to do so. Yeah, you did, except you didn't have them because you didn't start with those secular arguments. So it's dishonest to go tell people that, to tell people, no, this is a secular thing. No, say, I'm a Christian, I believe this, and I think it's right no matter what reason tells me, just like you should with every single thing. I think Jesus Christ is the Son of God. He died on the cross for my sins. I don't care what history or reason or anything says that. I believe that because my God told me that, and I have a close relationship with my God. Then do that. That's honesty. Be honest. Matt Walsh is not honest. He's just another version of these firebrands, of these political preachers, I call them, that are no better than the televangelists who take your money and throw it away. He's there to try to make a religious belief to force that on people, and the only way he could force that religious belief on others, instead of just keeping it to himself and enjoying the fruits of his religious belief, the only way he can make the rest of society step in line to it, is to frame it in the form of, this is not religious. Which brings me to the legal argument, right? So I think we've been arguing about this all wrong, and this is where I come. Again, nobody cares. This is just my personal belief. But when we're deciding whether or not marriage is a fundamental right, I think using these definitions, fundamental rights, all that stuff, is dangerous and just leads to bad results. If instead we said, what is the basis of this law? What is the basis of car dealerships can't be open on Sunday? Well, the basis of that law is a religious thing. No, there's basis of murder is not a religious thing. No matter what your religion, I promise you, everybody wants murder to be illegal. But the basis of what murder all entails might be a religious thing. If you're a religion that doesn't believe in self-defense, you might have something different. And if the answer to the question of why do you want the law to be this way is, well, deep down, it's religion, and everybody was honest about that, the Supreme Court could easily decide every issue just based on, no, if you're basing this on religion, then obviously it doesn't come from a place of reason, and we're not going to entertain it. We're not going to make car dealerships close on Sunday just because most people are religious and they want car dealership closed on Sunday. But we can make theft illegal because we can reason out that theft should be illegal, completely independent of religion, But maybe sodomy, we can't. And therefore, we get rid of sodomy and maybe that will solve all of our problems, but it won't solve the problem of the religious, in that they have to see the rest of society practice beliefs that they don't believe in. But of course, the problem with that is, you are doing the same thing, but you think you should be able to impose on others because might is right. But of course, if it turned out you became the minority, which is what's happening here in regards to marriage, you do not want them to be able to enforce that on you, even though it's not affecting you, but your belief affects them because you make it affect them. In any event, that's my 2 cents. I hope it made some sense to you. Probably only dorks who overthink things want it. I think Matt Walsh had it dead wrong. I think that's why Joe Rogan schooled him. I think he had this particular thing about marriage wrong. And again, you're talking to someone who, I've been married to a woman, a biological woman. I know what a woman is, for 20 years. So get out of here with that. I do want everybody to be in a household. I believe the nuclear family is important to culture, but I don't know how to enforce it without infringing on others' rights. In the event that's off topic, thank you for listening so far. If you have any comments, leave them down there. Please like, share, subscribe. I do all sorts of little videos about all sorts of things, mostly just using reasoning or little humor. So thank you for listening. Comments below. Have a good